So it gives you, again, you can be more flexible if they've got Windows or Macs and whatnot. And this is back in the training. We kind of already talked about this, so I'll kind of skip through some of these. In the requirements, again, the asset identification, threat identification, you know, what are those threats that can attack that service system? And again, if you're military or something like that, you even have additional different ones that are interesting. Guidelines, you might even have regulations that you have to worry about that could be built in. In the design phase, and we kind of talked about that threat modeling, again, a lot of people shy away from it because they're like, oh, it takes so long to make that first one. Okay, that's true. You've got to work through it and iterate on that first threat model, but that's where your security advisors come into play. And we would train people, but then I would just reassure people, get with so-and-so, they will walk you through it. You are not on your own. We just did training. Now you go do a threat model. We're going to help you create that. Once you create the threat model, your initial one, all you have to do is update it. That's all you have to do. It's easy once you get the first one. And the more people we got doing it, then they were like, oh yeah, it's not as time intensive as I feared. The fear is there at the beginning, but you kind of get them over that hump. And then what you do is you also pick who your security champions really are that really want to do it and they don't have that fear. Once you get a few of those on board, then I'd be like, well, so-and-so did it in like, I don't know, 30 minutes. I mean, come on, you know, you can do it. If they can do it, you can do it. Don't tell me you can't. So it kind of just helps get that momentum going. And then the user stories can be built on the threat, around the threat model as well. And that can be helpful. And then we kind of mentioned the scans. And again, tools, you have to decide what works for your environment. There's all different costs. There's open source. You probably aren't allowed to use open source. Right. So you're going to be paying a lot more. So there's, again, different tools, different environments. Choose what makes sense for the business, whatever that business is. Don't get down a vendor rabbit hole and don't get married to any one tool ever and any piece of security because the tools always change. So really approach it from a business perspective. And then if you can automate them, that's what you want to do. And by automate, we put it within the CI/CD pipeline. So as the developers were in Get and they're checking in their code, it would scan. So it was just doing their scan. They would go in and choose, I want to do a SAS scan, DAS scan, OSS, whatever they wanted. They could go in and choose. And then we worked extremely closely with the DevOps team who implemented our tools for us in that environment. And again, those are your huge partners. If you're not in a place where you have SecDevOps, you make fast friends with those DevOps people because they are your best friends. And that is one reason we were super successful is we had amazing leadership in that department and their staff was amazing and they wanted to work with us.
Oh, quick question. Have you ever done threat monitoring like on a Docker container or anything with Docker based?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You should. You should always do threat monitoring around the containers.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and I've popped in a couple of container discussions over the years, or the past few years, I should say, because it's more prevalent now. And that's one reason we use Microsoft's Threat Modeler because previous Count Life, we actually created an infrastructure template. Not, you had the code one, comes with it native, but they didn't have infrastructure pieces. So we built our own template because you can do that, and it's not that hard. We had a tech writer do it. We did the research on the threats. You load it all into a template, then you load it up to Threat Modeler, and so now the developer could go, oh yeah, and I'm using Kubernetes, or I've got a container here, or I'm using AWS or Azure or whatever it is. And so we actually created that for them so we could do SDLC on the infrastructure.
Nice. So
you have that flexibility. So I will mention that from a tooling perspective because, again, we found it flexible enough for us. And we did, previous team did assess other tools. And then, I know people that they'll whiteboard it, but then you've got to document it. And then, if you're regulated and you're audited and you don't have a document, that's going to be tough. So think about it also from an audit perspective. I have auditors come in, can I show what I need to show, or can the people show what they need to show? Verification, again, we kind of talked about the red teaming test, attack surface reviews. identify all the risks implemented and mitigations. You might have some residual risks that the business is willing, in systems areas, are willing to accept. And then that's where your risk management function comes into play. And then you would do whatever those risk management folks want you to do, put it in a specific tool, call it out, is it high, medium, or low, get the appropriate sign-offs and whatnot. So you may get to the end and still have some risk that the business is willing to accept. The key is, again, just documenting it. These are all on my LinkedIn.
Oh, no.
So you can, they're on my LinkedIn. I loaded them years ago.
Oh,
So,
okay.
you know, we did this talk in 2018, and it's still applicable because, again, it's not specific. And then from the approval process, and I kind of mentioned in the CAB, a change approval board. In an older company or like a government agency, the CAB is usually, they've got their meeting, they meet on Fridays. At this time, there's people from all over the room, and they go through this approval process around the room, hey, yes, 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 no, no, no. In an agile environment, especially in a startup, there is no change control board. And then you have to think about how can we stop at some point around release? How do we stop things from getting pushed that we didn't know about? And there's different tricks that you can do around this. I call them tricks. One of the biggest ways to even find out about a project is to dial in with finance and be a gate at the finance. When you request financial funding for a project, security gets pinged. So then you just know about it. And so that's one way that you can kind of find out that something's going to happen. But that is, or can be a challenge. So you have to kind of, again, find out what are all the different areas or what are all the steps that happen before something actually gets pushed to production. And think about that from a business perspective. How can we interject ourselves in that a little bit more or get notified? Kind of talked about agile. There's one time every sprint and bucket. And we kind of talked about the requirements that are established at every agile project. You're always going to do your scanning, and those are just repeatable user stories. Update threat model, run scans, and you can just copy them from, like, say, if you use Jira or another ticketing system, or project to project, because they don't change. And then the bucket ones are more of like the threat modeling, because that initial threat model takes a lot more time to get created, and then at that point you're just going to update it if you need it. Sometimes a system will change so significantly. I've had people say, I'm just going to build a whole new one. And by that time, you know, that's what made me proud is, you know, and the guy was like, you know, we got to redo our whole threat model. And I was like, well, do you need help? And he was like, no, I got it. And then I was like, oh, yes, thank God. So, you know, training folks to be self-sufficient is super helpful. And another bucket item is like that approval process. It just doesn't happen as often. And then the sprints, are people familiar with the agile methodologies and sprints and things like that? I mean, you've worked in agile and stand-ups and sprints. And usually sprints run in like 2 weeks. Some orgs run even tighter than 2 weeks, but you develop and push like almost every 2 weeks. You can even go that fast if you want. So it's just a faster way of pushing code and whatnot out. So I'm going to talk a little bit about threat modeling, and I will be honest, my colleague Josna typically does more of the threat modeling piece, so these are her slides that I will try and do justice to. And if you guys ever do have any follow-up questions, please feel free to message me on LinkedIn, and if I don't know the answer, I'm always happy to find the answer for you.
We don't use LinkedIn because of security issues, so is there another way to contact you by email?
What security issues?
Just problems with sharing information.
Oh, yeah, we can talk about it later. We'll take that offline. So why should a threat model be created? It's really a great structured way to see what are the attack surfaces that can happen with that application system code. Think about it even from a physical standpoint. If you've got your house and you've got the best alarm system in the world, but you didn't put an access point sensor on one of the main windows that has no bars and the lock is actually broken, then you can have that alarm set, it's on. You could have even like a gate around the front, but I can still get in that window, right? So having that discussion with somebody and walking through it step by step is where those things come out. And there's things you don't think about. A really good example, and I think she's got it in here, was a few years back, there was a casino that had like a saltwater fish tank or something. And to monitor it, they hooked it up to the casino network. Well, of course, somebody from an attack perspective saw that it was open. And they could get to that piece because the authentication wasn't properly done around that. And they got in that way, and then they jumped to the rest of the casino network and stuff. So that was a really great example of something super simple, super small, that nobody thought about the fish tank. So that's just another example of how to think about that. And another reason too is the tech debt. Anywhere I've ever worked, I think anywhere you will ever work, they're always going to have either they're going to have tech debt and security tech debt. So that's where it's really important to try and get them to engage you early, and that's the point. Because you don't want to have the tech. I'm like, you're going to have to do it now, or you're going to have to do it in the future, and it's going to be horrible because you're going to have to stop work. You're not going to be able to do new features, and you're going to have to make up for this previous time. So tech debt is a term. If you haven't heard it, you will hear it at some point because it's never changed. That's just the term. Stride actually was developed by Adam Showstock out of Microsoft many years ago. So he also created the threat modeler tool that I mentioned. And the concepts for Stride is spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. These, again, are very basic terms and terminology that have not changed over the years. They kind of give you a good overview of what to go through, and they help you, again, walk through those conversations with people. And having this in front of you, he's got a book out, too, on threat modeling. Again, a very basic book, still in publication, still used today. I've got one on my desk just because it's a great reference. And there's nothing wrong with ever having just even this page open while you're having a conversation with somebody until you're really used to it, walking through that with somebody. Like, oh, okay, hey, let's double check, denial of service. Is that one of those things that we need to talk about? So always feel comfortable having a reference in front of you. That just means you're being more diligent and thorough. And I think that people appreciate that. She had this example for an IoT service because at the time we were doing IoT. So person to devices, she had the devices around the cloud service and then third-party services. So when you're doing the threat model, obviously this is super high level, but your threat model will have like the objects and it'll show how the authentication is flowing. You'll actually have data flow also in your threat model. Data flow is super important to talk about when you're developing that threat model with somebody, because you can see if the authentication needs to be tighter even based on the type of data it is, and if it's top secret, restricted, highly restricted. A lot of times folks don't think about that when they're developing, and that's not normally, that's our job to think about that for them, and then our job to educate them, so that then going forward they start thinking about that more and how they want to do or how they want to protect that data that's in scope. And has anybody heard of the term ICP, information classification? Yeah, there's probably a lot of acronyms.
No.
Information classification.
No.
So the government has it, every company has it. It's part of every single regulation or like PCI, you name it. You have to have ICP. So information classification, there's, again, nothing wrong with ever having that, your company's information classification there, because it's your data classification. When you're having these discussions and you're like, okay, the data flow, what kind of data? And then that helps you kind of go through and identify that with them to see if it's personally identifiable, et cetera. And especially being in California now, we have even more regs around data and how data is handled with CCAP. So that's why you're getting all the notifications on Instagram and all that stuff. Like, here's how we handle your data. This is why you're getting those. And then the third-party cloud services, I mentioned